Welcome to Anti-Life Reviews, the only comic review show on YouTube. I look every day. Only one, no need to search. This month, November, I'm going to be looking at an absolute spitting satire of the superhero genre about violent caricatures. No, not The Boys, as I will never review Garth Ennis's work if I can help it, but something better. Marshal Law. I'm starting off the review with going over the first volume, which was 6 issues, published from October 1987 to April 1989, and was released by Epic, a Marvel imprint. So hit subscribe and let Tonomakai enforce Marshal Law. The writers and artists on this, writer and co-creator is Pat Mills, one of the defining writers on 2000 AD, including helping to create Judge Dredd, which clearly inspired some of Marshal Law. He also co-created Nemesis the Warlock, a comic I want to talk about eventually. Beyond that, he wrote some Doctor Who, Punisher 2099, and lots more. And the artist and fellow co-creator, Kevin O'Neill, the only man whose very art style was considered a bit too much for the Comics Code Authority, which is just fantastic. Also the co-creator of Marshal Law, as I mentioned, and Nemesis the Warlock with Mr. Mills above, as well as co-creator of the brilliant League of Extraordinary Gentlemen with the legendary Alan Moore, in which he did the art for pretty much all of it, I believe, outside of maybe the Nemo books. Okay, let's get some of the heavier backstory out of the way now, as not to bog down the overview. The U.S. government waged war in a place called the Zone, which was from the Panama Canal to the Amazon jungle. They waged this war using humans turned into metahumans. When the war ended, a lot of them came back with nothing but psychosis, superpowers, and a monkey on their back. There is a division of the police that hunt down these rogue metahumans. The best of them is Marshal Law. He hunts down heroes. He hasn't found any yet. We enter into a disturbing land of destruction, decadence, and debauchery. San Francisco, where, if you replace the metahumans with the homeless, isn't that far off from today. A woman dressed like the superheroine Celeste is running for her life, but a man in a black cloak with a bag over his head is upon her. Said he is the lowest form of life, a superhero. With razor-sharp claws and a toss off a building, she is dead, and he is the Sleep Man. We learn that the world's greatest hero and first man in the stars, the public spirit, is going to marry the real Celeste. We see the metahuman gangs, they harass and abuse, they kill and victimize, and Marshal Law is there to stop them. He tells us that all the women the Sleep Man has killed were dressed like Celeste, that he knows the Sleep Man can fly, a rare thing amongst metahumans, but the public spirit can fly. We meet one of the few friends of Marshall, Mrs. Mallon, local grocery store owner, and her wheelchair-bound son Danny, who works with the Marshal. Danny is quite the prude and mother's boy. We also meet the Marshal's live-in hyper-liberal girlfriend, Lynn, who doesn't know his job, but thinks she's dating old unemployed Joe Gilmore. She says the idea of making it with a masked man revolts her, and that Marshal Law is a fascist pig who is probably gay. But Joe is the most normal guy she knows. She also announced she will be protesting outside the public spirit's announcement about his marriage later. Marshal Law says the public spirit is his number one suspect because of his insatiable sexual appetites, lethal physique, and my psychological dislike of the son of a bitch. And also because he has had a fiancée before by the name of Virago, who mysteriously disappeared and is presumed dead. We move on to the public spirit's announcement, which also has a public prayer and a Q&A, where the Marshal takes it to the spirit in the Q&A portion, asking him about wearing a bag over his head, raping women, and his previous fiancé's murder. Elsewhere, Lynn is in the middle of a protest, but the protest she is dressed like Celeste. Well, this leads to her getting murdered by the Sleep Man, whose face we see, covered in boils, warts, gnarled, but he's also wearing a mask under his bag. The Sleep Man then lets out some escaped metahumans and flees. Marshal Law handles the villains the best he can and chases after the Sleep Man, who has left several dead in his wake. It's a close fight, but the Sleep Man bests the Marshal and leaves him hurting. Joe later laments the loss of Lynn, but it makes him resolve to double down on his pure hatred for the metahumans as he continues building his case that the public spirit is the Sleep Man. But the bosses tell him to play it cool, as the spirit has offered $1 million for medical care for broken down metahumans. They make Marshal play nice in public, but the law is only biding his time, making his case slowly but surely. We see the excessive steroid and drug use the public spirit uses to stay at the top of his game, but it's made his temperament volatile, his sexual desires out of control. Celeste uses her siren powers the best she can to calm him, but something is upsetting him she can't get to the core of, and their wedding is soon. Mrs. Mallon's grocery store has been destroyed by some gang warfare. Thankfully, Marshal Law was there to save some of it. She is obviously bitter and says some odd things about metahumans. Thanks to Danny's information, though, the Marshal goes to the priest who was originally going to officiate the public spirit and Celeste's wedding. The priest admits to the Marshal that public doesn't think Virago is dead, and he thinks she had a son. This leads to the wedding itself, and the sleep man arrives and kills Celeste, the real Celeste, before the ceremony. Marshal Law arrives, and after a tense moment, he finds Mrs. Mallon there and makes her confess her son Danny is the sleep man, and she is the long-lost Virago. We get the Francis Dollarhide history of Danny, the sleep man. He could fly, he had powers, he admired superheroes. But his mother beat him. She said superheroes are filth, the lowest form of life. If he used his powers, he'd be covered in germs, or worse. That love is a warm Bible. Danny was an outcast. But when he killed a bully in what appeared to be an accident, he understood, and he fell further into his mother's world. Eventually, she convinced him to kill Celeste so that she could never be replaced. Meanwhile, the public spirit attempts to negotiate with Virago, but he ends up beating her instead, and the father-son battle commences, but is ended quickly by Marshal Law, who seemingly kills Danny, ending the reign of the Sleep Man. We quickly find out the Sleep Man is not dead, but is taken in by the government for reprogramming. We'll see him later in the month. Without Marshal Law's knowledge, though. But the fight is not over, and the Marshal goes after the public spirit, who's hurt but not out. And after an extended fight, the government puts a bullet in the spirit's head and stages his death to look like a heroic death, of course. After some quite heavy-handed narration on the notion of superheroes and of war itself, Marshal Law laments the whole case and visits Lynn's grave to grieve. He's Marshal Law. He hunts heroes. He hasn't found any yet, but he knows where they are, buried, dead, and gone. Let's get into unpacking some of Marshal Law's first mini. I have to start with the art, as Kevin O'Neill is something special in the comics world. He has an unusual style that's a mixture of R. Crumb and a guy who draws caricatures on a boardwalk. His only artist in comic history, his actual existing art, was too much for the Comics Code Authority. Which, fuck those guys. But if you look at what he offers here, it's parody and satire to a wavering degree. But it's all very funny. You'll see tons of well-known comic characters in compromising position. This is a filthy comic, and the grime absolutely drips out of every panel. It can be disturbingly grotesque in a way that you might not expect. There are jokes loaded from front to back, and honestly the jokes can actually be funny to really in poor taste, like very poor taste. The whole thing has a surreal, barely coherent, bombastic look to it, which can be good or bad. But I think if you're going into this sort of thing, this Marshal Law, you might know what you're getting into. Now, the actual bones of this story are surprisingly well crafted. At its heart, it is a story about war and humanity and the things we sacrifice for capitalism and for the perception of freedom, the lies we are told by our masters, and the truth we ignore. It says some genuinely meaningful things, and I think if you can read past some of the things I will discuss in a moment, you will see a sincere and poignant story. That being said, there's a lot of padding, art and story. It's so busy trying to make fun of everything, and is so heavy-handed in doing so, that it often gets all of that confused for plot. There's lots about the zone, lots about the gang warfare, lots about making fun of pseudo-philosophical points, more than just trying to tell a good story with the point they want to make. It can really feel intensely schizophrenic, and can take more than one read to actually get to the point of what they are attempting to say. Leads directly into my next point and the reason why it's framed like this. Simply, Pat Mills hates superheroes. He finds them an offensive parody of capitalism, but he clearly has some respect for the hero genre as a general rule. And while this strips well into parody sometimes, the satire portions of it are with a deep understanding of this form, of heroes and villains. He can be up his own ass in a lot of this, but he does fundamentally get the nature of this kind of storytelling. And I want to contrast that with something quickly. Why I like this reasonably, and not The Boys. I have not seen the show, basing it simply on the comic, which is a load of shit. It's like Marshal Law without the tiny little bit of subtext or context that this has. It's just Garth Ennis hating superheroes and saying he's so much cooler and making awful jokes. This at least attempts to tell a cohesive story with flawed, reasonable characters for the kind of world they're in. The Boys, as a side note, is way too concerned with telling the same joke over and over again, which Garth Ennis can run the joke into the ground, shocker there. Marshal Law, here at least, does that kind of thing better, and I'll stand on that. And before my overview, here's some of the things I want to point out that are either crack me up or were just interesting. This is originally intended to be a Judge Dredd story, and honestly, I can completely see that. It reads like a middle Dredd story, that fantastic over-the-topness. We get some hilarious mentions on the superhero code of conduct, telling us things like no drugs, no lewd or offensive costumes, no using their powers to take advantage of members of the public, all the while that things are happening on panel. We get lots of the Dark Knight Returns in this, especially with the mutant leader as one of the gang members. That is handled by martial law. But beyond that, we get a number of references, such as the grave that reads, "It was a good death," which is a take on something Batman says a few times in The Dark Knight Returns. I do want to say, and I have mentioned some of it, if you're a person who's triggered by a number of things such as SA, extreme violence, some general sexual depravity, and well, a lot more, this might not be the comic for you, and I totally understand that. Overall, this is a fairly entertaining comic, and it's not totally nihilistic. There is some hope found here. There's some yearning and love for the past in it that I think deserves pointed out. But beyond that, it's totally and completely batshit insane. There's balls to the wall, edgelord madness, uber violent, hypersexual. It makes fun of so much, and half of it is almost clever. Martial Law is a comic that I am thankful exists because it's a parody of an art form I love, and it says some things that needed to be said. Even to this day, the critiques are valid. It's this a comic for everyone? No. Is it a comic for most people? Probably not. Your range for this is going to be angsty teen boys, jaded older comic fans, and people who just enjoy mad shit. Well, that was week 1 of my Martial Law month with the first miniseries. Would you folks like to see a Martial Law movie? Do you think such a movie, an extreme Judge Dredd, could get made today? Let me know down below. Let's check out my Patreon where you can support this channel for as little as $1. Add me on Instagram under Demon Peaks for Twin Peaks memes. And of course, come back next week. We're going to be looking at more Martial Law with Martial Law Takes Manhattan and Martial Law, The Kingdom of the Blind. Don't forget to subscribe, and thank you so much for being here. I appreciate each and every one of you. This has been the Tony Makaya, Master of Minds and Men, and goodbye.